They said you got lucky. They said it casually, almost kindly, as if they were giving you a compliment, as if everything you've built could be explained by timing, coincidence, or chance. You smiled, but something in you tightened, because you remember the nights they never saw, the discipline they never witnessed, the parts of you that had to break so something stronger could form. Luck is a convenient story. It keeps them comfortable. They can feel something changing in you. Your presence is different now, quieter, heavier, more deliberate. But instead of asking what it cost you, they call it luck. It's easier that way. If it's luck, they don't have to question their own inaction. What they see is the outcome, the result, the composed version of you standing in control. What they don't see is the restraint, the swallowed reactions, the days you showed up when disappearing would have been easier. You didn't stumble into this, and deep down, you know something they don't. This shift didn't happen overnight. What they didn't see were the early mornings when the world was still asleep, and you were already at war with yourself. No applause, no messages, just you and the decision to keep going. They didn't see the nights you stared at the ceiling, replaying conversations, betrayals, the subtle disrespect that slowly reshaped how you moved. They didn't see you choosing silence when reacting would have felt better, choosing discipline when comfort was available, choosing long-term growth over short-term validation. They saw none of the isolation, the invitations you declined, the distance that grew between you and people who no longer understood your focus. They mistook your withdrawal for weakness, not realizing it was construction. They didn't see how many times you almost quit, how close you came to returning to the version of yourself that was easier to digest, less intense, less driven, more acceptable. Most people go back. You didn't. You stayed through the discomfort, through the doubt, through the loneliness that whispers convincing lies. You endured being underestimated, being overlooked, being spoken to as if you were still who you used to be. And that endurance is rare, because silent growth doesn't trend. It doesn't get celebrated in real time. It happens in shadows, in routines, in private decisions no one tracks. They only arrived when the results became visible. But you remember the process, and now so do you. There was a season when everything grew quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood that not everyone deserved access to your becoming. Isolation wasn't a sentence. It was preparation, a tightening of focus, a deliberate step back from noise that once felt necessary. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped announcing your next move. The need to be understood began to feel heavier than being alone. So you chose silence. At first it felt unfamiliar. The empty spaces, the slower weekends, the distance from conversations that used to define you. But in that space, something sharpened. Your thoughts became clearer, your emotions less reactive, your direction less negotiable. This version of you is harder to access, not because you became cold, but because you became selective. Energy became currency. Time became sacred. You no longer responded to every invitation, every opinion, every subtle challenge to prove yourself. You withdrew strategically. They called it antisocial. They said you were changing. They were right. What they didn't understand was that evolution often requires temporary invisibility. Seeds do not break the surface the moment they are planted. They disappear first. They root themselves in darkness before they ever reach for light. That was you. You were isolation. You met parts of yourself that noise had drowned out. your fears, your ambition, your capacity for restraint. You learn to sit with discomfort without broadcasting it. You learn to build without applause. Loneliness stopped feeling like rejection. It started feeling like refinement. And slowly you realized something important. You weren't being left behind. You were being prepared. The real battle was never out there. It was inside you. No one applauded the moments you almost sent that message. The times your fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to defend yourself, to correct someone, to prove you were right. No one saw you close the app instead. No one felt the heat in your chest when you chose silence over reaction. Old habits don't disappear quietly. They negotiate, they whisper. They remind you how good it feels to win an argument, to get the last word, to be seen as strong in the loudest way possible. And there were days you wanted that. Days you wanted to erupt instead of endure. But you didn't. You confronted the parts of yourself that thrived on chaos. The insecurity that disguised itself as confidence. The need for validation dressed up as ambition. You sat with it. You studied it. You refused to let it steer. Self-doubt visited often. It questioned your pace, your methods, your silence. It asked whether disappearing was the same as failing, whether restraint looked too much like weakness. That was the war. Not against them, against your impulses, against the version of you that reacted quickly, trusted blindly, and burned energy trying to be understood. You had to outgrow yourself before you could outgrow your circumstances. And growth is uncomfortable when no one is clapping. You endured the discomfort of being misunderstood without correcting the narrative. You absorbed criticism without absorbing the identity attached to it. You let people underestimate you without rushing to update them. That is control. You're operating from somewhere deeper now, not from wounded pride, not from urgency, but from awareness, from observation, from measured intention. This kind of self-mastery is invisible. It doesn't trend. It doesn't impress the crowd in real time. But it is foundational. It is structural. It is the difference between temporary wins and permanent change. You built discipline where there used to be reaction. You built clarity where there used to be noise. And no one applauded. But you know, they need it to be luck, not because they hate you, not even because they doubt you, but because the alternative is uncomfortable. If your growth wasn't accidental, then it was intentional. If it was intentional, then it was disciplined, and discipline demands responsibility. It's easier to say you were in the right place at the right time. Easier to believe something aligned for you randomly, because if your results came from structure, sacrifice, and restraint, then that means the same path was available to them. And they chose differently. Spectators survive on distance. They observe outcomes, not process. They measure results, not repetition. From the outside, consistency looks simple. Emotional control looks effortless. Silence looks passive. They don't see the internal negotiations you had to win daily. Calling it luck protects their comfort. It allows them to admire you without questioning themselves. It keeps the story light, manageable, harmless, because if what you've built came from deliberate isolation, calculated patience, and long-term thinking, then your success becomes replicable. And replicable success removes excuses, so they reduce it. They compress years into a moment. They flatten complexity into coincidence, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. You see it now. The comment wasn't an insult. It was a projection, a way to make your evolution feel less intimidating, less instructive, less disruptive to their current habits. And once you understand that, the tension dissolves. You don't need to correct them. You don't need to argue the timeline. You don't need to recite the sacrifices like evidence in a trial. Their narrative keeps them comfortable. Yours keeps you evolving. And clarity changes everything. You stop taking their words personally. You stop feeling the urge to defend the unseen work. You recognize that not everyone is meant to understand a transformation they didn't commit to. Luck is lighter to say, discipline is heavier to carry. You chose the weight. What they call luck was a blueprint, not a dramatic reinvention, not a single breakthrough moment, a system. Quiet, repeatable, unglamorous. You built routines when motivation was unstable. You built structure when emotions were unpredictable. You stopped relying on how you felt and started relying on what you decided. That was the shift. You tracked your habits, guarded your time, paid attention to your energy the way other people monitor their image. You reduced friction. You eliminated distractions that once felt harmless but drained your focus. You made boredom productive. You made discipline automatic. No one applauds infrastructure. No one celebrates the foundation being poured. They only admire the building once it's visible. But you weren't chasing applause. You were reinforcing pillars, strengthening internal beams, installing emotional regulation where impulsiveness used to live. You learned to pause before responding, to think in months instead of moods, to measure progress in consistency, not excitement. That kind of thinking compounds quietly. Real power grows slowly. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. It stabilizes. It becomes undeniable without becoming loud. And what they see now? That composed presence. That controlled confidence. That steady upward movement. That is phase one. This isn't your final form because the systems are still running. The habits are still compounding. The standards have quietly risen again. You no longer build to escape your past. You build to expand your future. There is a difference. Performers need attention to sustain momentum. Builders need structure. Performers chase moments. Builders create leverage. Performers peak and plateau. Builders evolve in layers. You chose to build. You sacrificed short-term recognition for long-term positioning. You let people misunderstand you while you refined yourself. You accepted temporary invisibility to secure permanent stability. And now the results are visible enough for commentary. But the architecture beneath them is deeper than anyone assumes. You know how this was constructed. You know what it cost. You know how many adjustments were made quietly, how many weaknesses were reinforced before anyone noticed strength. That awareness doesn't make you arrogant, it makes you grounded. Because when you are the architect, you don't fear losing the spotlight. You know how to rebuild. And more importantly, you know you're still building. It didn't happen with an announcement. There was no dramatic reveal, no speech, no warning. It was subtle. Conversations started to feel different. The same people who once interrupted you began listening a little longer. The ones who used to offer advice started asking questions instead. The tone shifted before the words did. They can feel something changing. You don't rush to fill silence anymore. You don't overshare plans. You don't defend your decisions in real time. There is space between stimulus and response now, and that space carries weight. Your calm is no longer softness. It's signal. You stopped seeking validation, and something unexpected happened. The room adjusted. Respect replaced dismissal, not because you demanded it, but because your posture changed. Your standards became visible through action. You declined what no longer aligned. You disengaged without explanation. You chose precision over popularity. Silence became intimidating. Not because you were trying to be mysterious, but because you were no longer predictable. You weren't reacting on cue. You weren't performing for approval. You were observing, calculating, deciding. Measured energy unsettles people who rely on noise. You speak less, but when you do, it lands. You move slower, but with intention. You no longer chase opportunities that don't meet your criteria. You let them pass without fear. That's the shift. Your presence carries grounded certainty. Not hype, not ego. Certainty. The kind that comes from repetition and internal victories no one witnessed. You don't need to announce progress. The results surface on their own, and what unsettles them most is this. You look unbothered, not detached from reality, not numb, just regulated, centered, operating from a deeper baseline. The urgency that once defined you has dissolved into control. You aren't louder, you're steadier. You aren't trying to prove them wrong. You're building something too structured to be shaken by opinion. And in that steadiness, something powerful settles in. Calm dominance, not forced, not aggressive. Just present. They feel it before they understand it, and you feel it without needing to explain it. Silence was never emptiness. It was strategy. While others were performing their ambition, broadcasting every move, you were refining yours. While they reacted to every opinion, every provocation, every trend, you were recalibrating, adjusting quietly, improving without announcement. Silence protected your focus. When you stopped explaining yourself, you reclaimed energy. When you stopped arguing, you reclaimed clarity. When you stopped seeking immediate recognition, you reclaimed time. And time, used correctly, compounds. Noise scatters attention. Silence concentrates it. In that concentration, you began to see clearly. You saw who respected your boundaries and who only valued your availability. You saw who supported your growth and who preferred your older, more convenient version. Silence filtered your circle without confrontation. It revealed who was real. The suffering you once questioned became training. The loneliness became sharpening. Every moment you felt overlooked strengthened your independence. Every time you endured misunderstanding without collapsing into self-doubt, your internal foundation thickened. Pain stopped being personal. It became instructional. You learned patience in seasons where nothing seemed to move. You learned restraint when proving yourself would have been easier. You learned to hold vision without external reinforcement. That is power, not the loud kind. Not the kind that dominates rooms with volume, the kind that dominates outcomes with precision. Isolation was not abandonment. It was conditioning. It forced you to rely on your own structure, your own standards, your own discipline. And now, looking back, you see the pattern. Silence wasn't what held you back. It's what positioned you ahead. Now, when they say lucky, you don't flinch. You don't rush to correct the narrative. You don't list the sacrifices. You don't reopen chapters just to make a point. The urge to be fully understood has loosened its grip because the results speak in ways explanations never could. Power doesn't explain itself. It demonstrates, it moves, it builds. And then it lets observation do the rest. You've realized something freeing. Not everyone is meant to understand your process. Some people only meet you at the outcome. That's where their perspective begins, and that's where it ends, and that's fine. This version of you is harder to access, Not guarded out of fear, but protected out of wisdom. You don't hand out context to those who didn't participate in the climb. You don't translate your growth into language that makes others comfortable. You simply continue. There is a steadiness in that. A quiet detachment that feels like peace, not avoidance. Resentment dissolves when you stop expecting recognition from those who never saw the work. You outgrew the need for applause. You outgrew the need to defend your timeline. You understand now that being misunderstood is sometimes the cost of evolving beyond familiar roles. And that cost no longer feels heavy. It feels clean. Let them call it luck. You'll call it preparation. It was never luck. It was repetition when no one was watching. Discipline when no one was asking. Endurance when no one would have blamed you for quitting. What looks sudden was layered slowly. What looks effortless was engineered through friction. You built this in silence, not to impress them, not to prove a point, but to become someone you could rely on. Every restrained reaction, every early morning, every decision to stay focused instead of distracted added another layer of control. And now you move differently, not rushed, not reactive, not desperate for acknowledgement. You operate with measured intention. You choose carefully. You speak precisely. You invest your energy where it multiplies instead of where it drains. This isn't your final form. What they see now is stability. What they don't see is the next evolution already in motion. The standards rising again, the systems refining again, the vision expanding beyond what once felt impossible. You're no longer building to survive, you're building to scale. Let them keep their version of the story. Let them simplify what they never studied. You don't need to correct it because you know the truth. Built in silence, rising in control and still becoming.